When I asked him to rub my shoulders that night, I didn't mean anything by it. At least, I don't think I did. My back hurt after cleaning the whole afternoon, and my husband had once again left earlier than planned, claiming a last-minute flight. The house was too quiet, the wine too cold, and the silence in my chest louder than usual. He looked up from his laptop, my stepson, and said, "Sure," like it was the most normal thing in the world. "Just a massage. Nothing more." His fingers were firm, careful. Not hesitant, but respectful, and that somehow made it worse. I could feel the lines of my own loneliness being traced along my spine, pressed into muscle. It was nothing, I kept telling myself. But then I felt it, that moment when my body betrayed me, when I leaned back just slightly, when his breath caught for a second. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I didn't. I stood up too quickly, mumbled something about going to bed. But I couldn't sleep. I lay there, eyes open, heart tight. Because 3 weeks ago, I was just a wife. And now I have a story to tell. One I never meant to live. One I never thought I would hide. But before I tell you everything, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And be honest, have you ever asked for something that seemed innocent, only to realize it changed everything? He wasn't supposed to be staying with us this long. That's how it started, just a few nights while his apartment was being painted, or fumigated, or something. I don't even remember what the excuse was now, but I said yes, of course. It would be strange to say no. It's not like we were strangers. He arrived with a single suitcase and a bottle of wine, smiling politely as always. Not overly warm, not distant either, just appropriate. And for some reason, that appropriateness made me feel even more aware of myself than I usually did. I noticed how wrinkled my blouse was when I greeted him. I noticed how dry my hands felt when I shook his. I noticed how I suddenly wanted to be the kind of woman who didn't need to notice those things. My husband was late, as usual. He texted that something came up. Some emergency with one of the clients. I used to be surprised, then I used to be hurt. Now, I just checked the wine rack and said, "Well, we might as well open this one," and he nodded and said, "Sure," and that was that. We had dinner together, nothing special. I reheated a casserole I'd made 2 days earlier, and he was kind enough to say it smelled amazing. I think I made a joke about burning it, and he laughed the kind of laugh that wasn't mocking, but genuine. That laugh stayed with me longer than it should have. I found myself glancing at him during the meal, observing how he had grown into himself, broader shoulders than before, more measured in his words. There was a calmness to him that made the house feel more alive. It was just the two of us, and yet, the silence didn't feel empty. After dinner, he helped with the dishes. I told him he didn't need to, but he insisted. We worked side by side at the sink. Our movements felt synchronized in an odd way. I would reach, and he'd already be handing something. I would turn, and he'd already stepped aside. Little things. Coincidences. But they accumulated. We sat in the living room afterward, each with a glass of wine. He pulled out his laptop to catch up on emails. I scrolled through my phone aimlessly, not really reading anything. The sound of the keys tapping, the warmth of the fireplace, the low jazz I'd put on, it all blurred into something that felt soft. I didn't want to disturb it. But my back was aching, and without thinking too much, I said, "God, I really need a massage." It was meant to be a joke. Or maybe just one of those things you say out loud, half hoping no one hears. But he heard. "You want me to try?" he asked, closing his laptop halfway. I hesitated, just for a second, then shrugged. Sure. Why not? The words tasted strange as I said them. Too casual. Too quick. I moved to sit on the floor, just beneath the couch. He shifted behind me. His hands were warm. Confident. They moved across my shoulders like he was writing something in a language I almost understood. Not too gentle, not too firm. Just right. He didn't speak. Neither did I. For a while, it was only the music, the fire, and his breath behind me. I didn't know how to breathe. My skin felt too tight. Every cell of my body was paying attention. The way his thumbs circled just beneath the blades of my shoulders. The way I instinctively closed my eyes. The way I tilted my head just slightly to the side when he moved toward my neck. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. That's what I told myself later. But it did. I stood up too fast, nearly spilling my wine. He looked up, slightly startled, concern in his eyes. "You okay?" he asked. I forced a smile. Yeah. Just remembered I need to take my vitamins." He nodded slowly. "All right." I left the room. My heart didn't calm down for at least an hour. Lying in bed, I kept rewinding it all. Not just the massage. Not just the way his hands felt. But the way I responded. The way I leaned in. The way my breath changed. The way I didn't want it to stop. I'd been married for over 20 years. That night, it felt like I'd opened a window that had been sealed shut for most of them. I didn't know what came through that window yet, but I felt it. Cold, unfamiliar air. And something else. A whisper of danger. Or maybe a whisper of something I'd forgotten I missed. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, rolled over, and closed my eyes. But sleep wouldn't come. Just the memory of touch. Not the touch itself, but what it unlocked. And I knew, deep in my gut, that something had shifted. That tomorrow wouldn't be the same. That I wouldn't be the same. I didn't know what to do with that truth. So I did nothing. I just lay still. Listening. Remembering. And feeling everything I'd tried so hard not to feel. The morning after wasn't supposed to feel different, but it did. The kitchen was the same. The light through the window had the same tired softness. The floor creaked in the same spot near the sink, and yet, every detail vibrated with something unspoken. I moved slower. My hands hesitated over the coffee pot. The silence was no longer peaceful, it had shape now, and weight. It pressed down on my shoulders as if to remind me of his hands the night before. He entered the room while I was rinsing out my mug. He said good morning, and I said it back. Our voices sounded normal, too normal. Like actors reading lines from a script we weren't sure we had written. I didn't look at him directly. I watched his reflection in the window instead, the way he reached for the cereal box, the way his fingers tapped twice against the counter while he waited for the kettle to boil. All of it told me he was feeling it too. I had hoped that ignoring it might shrink the thing between us, but it didn't. If anything, it grew in the quiet. Every glance became a calculation, every step a decision. Do I linger in the same room, or leave before it feels intentional? Do I speak, or let him start? I spent half the day pretending to read, the other half moving items around in the pantry as if reorganizing the soup cans might fix whatever had rearranged inside me. I thought about calling my husband. Just to hear his voice. Just to tether myself to something familiar. But I didn't. I told myself he was probably busy, that he wouldn't pick up anyway. It was a lie. I knew that. But it was easier to stay silent than to risk hearing the sound of normalcy when I didn't feel normal at all. By late afternoon, I decided to get out of the house. I said I needed to go to the pharmacy, but I drove past it. I ended up at the lake instead, the one we used to visit in the early years of marriage, when weekends felt like a break rather than a continuation of the same routine. I parked and walked to the bench by the water, sat there for a long time, watching the slow movement of the surface. Ducks drifted by without urgency. Children's voices echoed from the playground across the path. Everything was ordinary. And I felt like a crack in the middle of it all. I tried to think about what had really happened. Tried to name it. A mistake? A lapse? A moment of weakness? But none of those words fit exactly. It wasn't planned, and it hadn't gone far, not physically. But emotionally? I didn't know how far was too far. I only knew I had crossed something. I'd stepped out of a line I'd always assumed was fixed in place. When I finally returned home, the sun was already low. The living room was dim, the kitchen empty. I moved quietly, half hoping he was asleep or out for a walk. But as I passed the hallway, I saw him, sitting on the floor of his room, headphones on, eyes closed, head nodding slightly to music I couldn't hear. He looked peaceful. Untouched by everything that was rattling through me. And for a split second, I envied him. Then he opened his eyes, and we locked eyes through the doorway. Neither of us moved. I gave him a small nod, the kind that says I'm fine when I'm not. He didn't smile. He just returned the nod, then turned his eyes back down. I kept walking. Dinner was awkward. I made pasta, something simple, and set 2 plates out like usual. He came into the kitchen just as I was draining the noodles. He offered to help, and I declined, maybe too quickly. We sat across from each other, eating in near silence. The clink of the fork against the plate was too loud. At one point, he cleared his throat and said, "I think I'll head out in a day or 2. Get back to my place. The painting should be done." I nodded. That's probably a good idea. It was the first honest thing I'd said all day. After dinner, I retreated to the bedroom. I didn't turn on the TV or pick up my book. I just sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the framed photo on the nightstand, the one of my husband and me in Venice years ago. We looked young. Not just physically, but emotionally. Open. Alive in a way that felt almost embarrassing now. I reached out and touched the glass, then quickly pulled my hand back. I didn't want to feel anything. Later that night, I heard him laughing. A phone call, maybe. His door was half closed, the light spilling into the hallway. I stood outside my room, barefoot on the hardwood, listening to the warmth in his voice. It wasn't flirtatious. Just real. Effortless. And it hit me, how rarely I heard that tone anymore. Not just from him, but from anyone. I returned to my room and lay down in the dark. My thoughts wouldn't stop spinning. Not just about what had happened, but what it revealed. I thought I was content. I thought I had made peace with routine, with predictability. But something about those few minutes on the floor, his hands moving with care and restraint, it lit a match inside me. And now I couldn't unsee the shadows it cast. Was it really about him? Or was it about the parts of myself I thought I'd buried, the parts that still longed for touch, for attention, for something unspoken and simple? I wrapped the blanket tighter around me, trying to squeeze myself back into shape. To undo whatever had come undone. But deep down, I knew I couldn't go backward. I had opened a door. And even if I never walked through it again, I would always know it was there. Waiting. I woke up early the next morning, though I hadn't really slept. The hours had passed in fragments, half dreams, tossing from one side to the other, always returning to the same moment, his hands on my shoulders. There was no clear emotion, just a persistent weight in my chest. Not guilt, not quite. More like confusion layered over silence, and something else I wasn't ready to name. The house was quiet, and I lingered in bed longer than usual. I didn't want to cross paths with him yet. I didn't want to test whether whatever had shifted between us had settled or was still shifting. Eventually, I got up and went through the motions, brushing my teeth, tying my robe, pouring a glass of water. I avoided looking in mirrors. He was already in the kitchen, finishing breakfast. A bowl and spoon sat in front of him, and he was scrolling on his phone. He looked up and nodded once. I returned it. No words. The kind of exchange you might have with a neighbor you barely know, not someone who touched you so intimately just days ago. I made coffee slowly, every movement deliberate. He stood and rinsed his bowl without saying anything else. The air between us was cold but controlled. I thought of speaking, of filling the room with something, anything, but I couldn't think of a single sentence that didn't sound rehearsed. After he left the kitchen, I sat alone with my mug, hands wrapped around it like it might offer answers. I couldn't even remember what I used to think about during mornings before he came to stay. There had been a rhythm to my days, even if it was dull. Now, every hour carried its own noise, even in silence. Later, I decided to run errands. Not because I needed anything urgently, but because staying in the house felt impossible. I grabbed my purse and walked out without telling him. I doubt he noticed. Driving helped. The movement, the road under me, the ordinary sights outside the window, it grounded me. I stopped by the pharmacy. I stood in the aisle of vitamins far longer than necessary, reading labels without taking anything. I browsed a clothing shop I hadn't been in for years, touching fabrics as if I might find some part of myself woven between the sleeves. I bought a scarf I didn't need, in a color I wouldn't normally wear. When I returned home, I felt slightly steadier. Until I stepped into the hallway and saw his door cracked open. He wasn't inside. His laptop was open on the desk, a half-empty glass of water beside it. It was just a glimpse, but it made me stop. The scene was intimate in its own way, unguarded, unarranged. I went straight to my room and sat at the edge of the bed. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just sat, feeling the weight of things I couldn't undo but wasn't sure I regretted either. It wasn't about love or betrayal, not yet. It was about space. About something broken open inside me. Hours passed in fragments again. I folded laundry I didn't care about. I organized drawers that were already neat. I reheated leftovers I didn't want. When he came to the kitchen around 6, I was standing at the stove, stirring soup that didn't need stirring. He offered to help, and this time I let him. We worked side by side in silence. Not awkward, just cautious. Like two people waiting for the right time to speak but unsure if it would ever come. We sat down and ate, both of us keeping our eyes mostly on our bowls. He finally broke the silence. I was thinking I might leave tomorrow. Head back early. I nodded slowly, pretending to consider. If that's what you want. There was a pause. Feels like the right time, he said. Again, I nodded. Nothing in me protested, and yet everything in me twisted. I kept my voice steady. All right. After dinner, he thanked me, placed his bowl in the sink, and walked to his room. The sound of the door closing was soft, but final. It echoed through the house in a way I didn't expect. I sat at the table long after he left, staring at my hands. There were lines on them I didn't remember noticing before. My skin was thinner than it used to be. I turned them over, palms up, then down again, as if searching for something invisible. I realized then that what unsettled me most wasn't what had happened between us. It was how quickly something dormant inside me had responded. How easily I had let a moment stretch into something else. How my body had reacted before I even understood what I was feeling. That kind of response doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from absence. From being touched too little. From being looked at and not really seen. I didn't blame my husband, not fully. Life had simply settled into roles, into obligations, into routines. We loved each other, in a way. But somewhere along the way, I had stopped feeling like a woman and started feeling like a fixture. That night, I went to bed early. I didn't bother turning on the TV or checking my phone. I lay in the dark, listening for the sounds of the house. I heard a door creak once. I heard the fridge hum. I imagined I heard footsteps outside my door, but I didn't check. Instead, I stared at the ceiling and let the truth settle in. It wasn't about him, not really. It was about the way I had disappeared from my own life without even noticing. And the quiet, ordinary moment on the living room floor had made that fact impossible to ignore. I hadn't made a decision. Not yet. I didn't know what I wanted, only that I couldn't go back to pretending I didn't want anything at all. Sleep came slowly, if at all. And when it did, it was full of images that weren't clear or linear. A hand brushing mine. The sound of a closing door. The cold feel of a wine glass. And a single word echoing through it all. Tomorrow. I didn't sleep deeply, but when I opened my eyes, the sun was already pushing through the blinds in thin, golden lines. The kind of morning light that usually signaled comfort, a slow start, a warm cup of coffee. But not this time. This morning carried a sharpness. Like something unfinished was still lingering in the corners of the house. I sat on the edge of the bed, feet flat on the floor, not moving for a while. I heard the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway, a door creaking. It was enough to make me hold my breath. He was still here. For now. And that knowledge sat heavy on my chest. In the kitchen, the silence stretched as I made coffee. No music, no television, no background noise. I didn't even bother turning on the lights. The shadows were easier to sit with. He came in not long after, already dressed, a small overnight bag slung over his shoulder. He looked like he had made up his mind. He moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who didn't want to stay a moment longer than necessary. He poured himself some water, nodded to me with a quiet good morning that I barely returned. The air between us was stretched too thin to carry anything more. I watched him drink from the glass, the way his throat moved, the way he avoided eye contact. I knew he wasn't running from me, not exactly. He was running from the discomfort. The line that had been crossed in the fact that neither of us could pretend it hadn't happened. I wanted to say something. To ask him to stay. To tell him that his presence had reminded me of something I didn't know I had lost. But I couldn't form the words. It felt selfish. Indulgent. Worse, dangerous. So I stood there, coffee in hand, and said nothing. He left before noon. A short, awkward goodbye. He thanked me for letting him stay. I nodded, said something polite, maybe even smiled, though I'm not sure it reached my eyes. Then the door closed behind him, and he was gone. The silence that followed was different than before. Heavier. Not absence, but aftermath. I didn't know what to do with myself. The house felt too clean, too still. I walked from room to room without purpose. Rearranged throw pillows, wiped down a counter that didn't need wiping, stood in the hallway where his door had been left ajar and stared at the empty space. I ended up in the backyard, seated on one of the old patio chairs. The garden looked overgrown. I hadn't noticed before. There was a wildness to it, a kind of rebellion in the way the vines reached up the fence, the way the grass pushed through cracks in the stone. It mirrored how I felt, tangled, growing in directions I hadn't meant to. The day passed slowly. I didn't check my phone. I didn't open my laptop. I didn't answer when a neighbor knocked briefly, probably wanting to borrow something or chat. I just stayed in that chair, watching the light change as the hours slipped away. By evening, I felt restless. My body wanted to move, but my mind wouldn't follow. I needed to be somewhere else, anywhere else. Without thinking too much, I grabbed my bag and keys and drove. No destination, just the road and the hum of the engine. I ended up downtown, near the bookstore I used to visit often. I hadn't been there in months. I wandered through the aisles without looking for anything in particular. My fingers traced spines, titles blurred past me. At one point, I picked up a novel I'd read years ago, something about starting over. I put it back down almost immediately. When I left the store, the street lights had flickered on. The city was alive in its quiet way, couples walking hand in hand, people laughing outside cafes, a street musician playing something soft and slow on a guitar. I stood there for a moment, absorbing it all, and felt something shift inside me. Not a resolution. Not clarity. Just space. I drove back slower than usual. When I got home, the house greeted me with its usual silence. I turned on a lamp in the living room and sat on the couch, not ready to face the bedroom. I looked at my phone for the first time that day. No messages. No missed calls. I told myself that was good. That it was better this way. But the truth was, I wasn't sure. I knew what we shared wasn't sustainable. I knew it would complicate everything. And still, the silence between us had felt more honest than some of the conversations I'd had in years. It wasn't about romance. It wasn't about fantasy. It was about feeling seen. Touched. Noticed. And now, without that, the world felt duller. I sat there until it was nearly midnight. Eventually, I went to bed, turned off the light, and lay in the dark. I listened for sounds that wouldn't come anymore, footsteps in the hallway, the hum of his voice behind a closed door, the soft thud of him setting a glass in the sink. I closed my eyes and let myself miss it. Not him. Just it. The way it felt to not be invisible. 3 days passed. He didn't call. I didn't either. I told myself that was a good thing, that space was necessary, that what had happened, and not happened, between us needed to disappear quietly, like fog lifting on its own when the sun finally comes. But the truth is, I checked my phone more often than I should have. I reread the last text he sent, a simple thank you, nothing more, until the words became meaningless. I told myself I had to let this go. I repeated it often. I didn't believe it once. My husband returned that evening, suitcase in hand, voice full of exhaustion. He kissed my cheek absent-mindedly as he passed me in the hallway, muttered something about meetings running long and delayed flights. I nodded, smiled where appropriate, asked if he was hungry. He wasn't. Just tired. Always tired. He disappeared into the shower while I stood in the kitchen, watching water boil for tea I didn't want. We sat together in the living room later, watching a documentary he put on. I don't remember the subject. I couldn't focus. He talked over parts of it, explaining things I wasn't listening to. I responded with nods and soft acknowledgments. At one point, he put his hand on my knee, a small, habitual gesture that once might have meant something. Now, it barely registered. I felt it, of course. But not in the way I used to. It was pressure, not connection. A mark of routine more than affection. I went to bed before him that night, claiming a headache. I laid under the covers staring at the ceiling. I could hear him in the other room, opening and closing drawers, brushing his teeth, clearing his throat. His presence should have been grounding. Instead, it felt like another wall closing in. Not because of him, not exactly. But because I had changed, not all at once, but slowly, almost invisibly, and now I couldn't unchange. The next morning, he was already gone before I woke up. A note on the counter, had to be at the site early. Be back late. Love you. I read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in the drawer beside the fridge. I didn't know why I kept it. Maybe out of habit. Maybe guilt. Maybe just because it felt wrong to throw it away. That afternoon, I found myself driving again. Nowhere specific in mind, just a need to move. The town felt small suddenly, streets too familiar, faces too known. I ended up on the far side of the city, near a row of boutique shops and cafes I rarely visited. I walked aimlessly, glancing in windows, avoiding my reflection when I caught it. There was a bench across from a florist, and I sat there, watching people come and go. Most were couples. I didn't realize how many until I started counting. And then, I saw him. Across the street. A bookstore bag in his hand. Alone. Walking slowly. I froze. My breath caught. I hadn't expected this. I hadn't prepared. I almost looked away, but he turned at that moment. Our eyes met. The second stretched into something long and unnameable. He didn't smile. Neither did I. But we both crossed the street. We met near the florist, in the space between sidewalk cracks and memory. Hi, he said, his voice quiet. Hi, I answered. A pause. And then, you look good. I didn't. I knew that. But I nodded anyway. You too. We stood there, two people carrying too much between them to speak easily. I gestured toward a coffee shop nearby, and he nodded. We walked there together, ordered drinks, found a quiet table in the back. We didn't talk for the first few minutes. Just sat, sipping, listening to the low murmur of conversation around us. I focused on the way the steam curled from his cup, the small twitch at the corner of his mouth, the way he kept his hands folded in his lap. Finally, he said, I wasn't sure if I should say anything. I shook my head. I wasn't sure if I wanted you to. Another silence. Then I added, but I'm glad you did. He looked at me then, really looked. I felt it in my chest. I thought about you, he said. I didn't respond right away. What could I say to that? That I had thought about him, too? That I'd built entire conversations in my head that would never happen? That I missed something I never really had? Instead, I said, it's been strange. He nodded. Yeah. We didn't discuss details. We didn't unpack what had happened. We didn't name it. It hung between us, invisible but present. A current neither of us could fully escape. And then, without warning, without plan, something shifted. He reached across the table, not for my hand, but just slightly, a movement that meant nothing and everything at once. I didn't think. I leaned in. We kissed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even desperate. It was quiet. Certain. A pause in the noise of everything else. We kissed. And then we pulled back. The world didn't tilt. The room didn't spin. But something inside me cracked. He looked down, then back up. I didn't know what he saw on my face, but I felt bare. I should go, he said. I nodded. Yeah. We stood. Walked out together. On the sidewalk, he hesitated. Take care of yourself, he said. You too, I replied. And then he was gone. I didn't turn around to watch him leave. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just stood there, the taste of that moment still warm in my chest, and wondered what I was supposed to do now. Because the truth was, I wasn't sure I could go back to being untouched. Not anymore. The day after we kissed, I tried to live as if nothing had changed. I told myself it was a lapse in judgment, a mistake sparked by coincidence. We'd run into each other, emotions resurfaced, and now it was over. That's what I repeated, again and again, while doing the laundry, cleaning the countertops, and folding towels with an aggression I didn't usually apply to domestic chores. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. It wasn't just a kiss. It was confirmation. A silent agreement that something still lived between us. That it hadn't disappeared with distance or time. I didn't know what to do with that knowledge. I didn't want it. But I did. My husband, oblivious to the storm within me, had fallen back into his usual patterns with ease. Long hours, late-night calls, muttered complaints about coworkers. He was around but not truly present. That used to feel like safety. Now it just felt like absence. That morning, he left before sunrise. A business trip, again. He kissed my forehead in the dark, his breath smelling faintly of mouthwash and sleep. I murmured something I didn't remember, turned over, and waited for the sound of the garage door closing. When it did, I opened my eyes, stared at the ceiling, and exhaled. I didn't know if I was relieved or disappointed. The house felt different without him, but not in the way it used to. It wasn't freedom I felt. It was exposure. Like now, anything could happen, or nothing could. Both options scared me. I moved through the day slowly. The weather had turned colder, and the wind pressed against the windows like it wanted to come inside. I made tea, wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, and sat on the couch, staring at the empty space across from me. Eventually, I picked up my phone. I didn't have a plan when I texted him. I didn't even know what I wanted. I just wrote, "If you're free later, I'd like to talk." I expected silence. Maybe even relief from not receiving a reply. But a few minutes later, my screen lit up, "I'll come by around 5. That gave me hours. And yet, the time passed like a breath. I changed my clothes 3 times, settling on something casual but not careless. I put on makeup, then wiped most of it off. I fixed my hair, then pulled it back. I didn't want to look like I was trying, even though I obviously was. It wasn't vanity. It was defense. Armor. A way to feel like I still had some control over this. At exactly 5, he arrived. No knocking, he texted from the driveway, and I opened the door before he even stepped out of his car. He looked the same. Calm. Collected. But his eyes held something different now, not intensity, but weight. We didn't hug. Didn't exchange pleasantries. I led him into the living room, gestured toward the couch. We sat, not too close. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, but it wasn't comfortable either. It was full. I tried to speak first, but nothing came out. He beat me to it. I wasn't sure if I should come. I nodded slowly. I wasn't sure if I should ask. He waited, letting me continue. I didn't. I was still untangling the words inside me. "It's not simple," I finally said. He gave a short nod, then leaned back. It never was. We sat there, the ticking of the wall clock filling the space between us. "I don't know what I want," I admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "But I know I'm not okay pretending nothing happened." He looked at me then, not with pity or apology, but with understanding. "I didn't expect to feel this much," he said. Neither did I. That was the truth. I stood up, needing movement, needing space. I walked toward the window, arms crossed, watching the trees sway outside. "This house," I said, "has been quiet for so long. I think I stopped noticing it. Until you showed up." I didn't turn around, but I felt him listening. I wasn't unhappy, I continued. At least, I didn't think I was. But then something shifted. Something woke up, and now I don't know how to put it back to sleep. He didn't try to fix it. Didn't offer solutions. He just let me speak. I don't want to blow up my life, I said. But I also don't want to keep pretending I'm not drowning in it. I finally turned to face him. His expression was unreadable, but there was no judgment there. Just quiet recognition. You don't owe me anything, he said gently. But I'm here if you need something. Even if it's just to talk. It was the kindness in that statement that undid me. Not the offer. The restraint. The awareness of boundaries we couldn't afford to cross again, not yet, maybe not ever, but also the willingness to be present in spite of that. I sat back down, closer now, but still with space between us. Do you remember that night in the kitchen? I asked suddenly. When you handed me the cup and our hands touched? He nodded once. That was the first time in years I felt real, I said. Like I wasn't invisible. He didn't respond right away. Then, quietly, I saw you. I still do. My eyes burned, but I blinked the sting away. We didn't move closer. We didn't fall into each other's arms. There was no rush forward. We just sat there. Breathing the same air. Sharing the same silence. Letting the weight of everything that wasn't said sit between us like something sacred. And as the sun dipped below the trees and the room grew dim, I realized I wasn't looking for answers. I was looking for truth. And for the first time in a very long time, I had found some. The night fell slowly, the way it does when something waits at the edge of it. After he left, I stood in the hallway for a long time, watching the space where his shoes had been, the quiet outline of the door as it clicked shut behind him. The house felt still, but not in the usual way. Not the quiet that comes with routine or sleep. This was a held breath. A moment suspended. I moved through the next hour without direction. I checked the windows even though I knew they were locked. I wandered into rooms with no purpose, stood in doorways without remembering why. I washed my hands and forgot to dry them. Everything was slightly off, as though I were living in a version of my home that didn't quite fit anymore. I wasn't sure if it was me or the place that had changed, only that something had. When I finally entered the bedroom, the bed looked too big. I turned on a lamp and sat on the edge, not bothering to change clothes. The clock on the nightstand ticked louder than usual. Or maybe I was just listening harder. It wasn't a decision. Not really. I didn't write it out, didn't debate it. I simply stood, walked into the hallway, and picked up my phone. My hands didn't shake. There was no dramatic breath, no mental rehearsal. I just typed, "Are you still awake?" His reply came less than a minute later, "Yes." There was another pause before I sent, "Can you come back?" No question mark. I couldn't handle punctuation. I didn't want to see it staring back at me, demanding something I couldn't name. Again, the response came quickly, "I'm on my way." The air felt thicker after that. I tried to stay still, to sit and wait. But the stillness was unbearable. I moved into the kitchen, put on water for tea I wouldn't drink. I paced near the front door, checked the porch light even though I knew it was working. Every noise outside made my breath catch, a car passing, a wind-blown branch against the fence. Then I saw headlights. A quiet car door. Footsteps. And finally, his silhouette in the doorway. I opened the door before he could knock. Neither of us said anything. I stepped aside. He entered. The moment he crossed the threshold, the house changed again. Not louder. Not brighter. just fuller. As though his presence filled in whatever had been missing since the moment he left. We didn't speak. I led him to the living room. But we didn't sit. I couldn't sit. The silence stretched long enough that it felt like language was unnecessary. Like words would only complicate what was already understood. I walked past him, toward the hallway. I didn't look back to see if he followed. He did. We moved through the house like ghosts in a dream, slow and certain. Every creak of the floorboard sounded louder now, but it didn't stop us. In my bedroom, I paused near the window. The curtain shifted slightly from a breeze. I closed it with trembling fingers. Behind me, he stood quietly, waiting, respecting the space without retreating from it. I turned around, and our eyes met. And in that quiet, suspended moment, nothing more needed to be said. We spent the night together. Morning arrived quietly, without warning. I had drifted into sleep at some point, but it was the kind of rest that doesn't restore anything. When I opened my eyes, the room was filled with pale light, the kind that makes everything look softer than it really is. I lay still, my body pressed into the mattress, the weight of the blanket oddly comforting against my skin. He was already gone. I didn't hear him leave. I didn't remember the sound of the door, or footsteps in the hallway. Just the stillness that followed, a silence too whole to be shared. At first, I stared at the ceiling, not moving. Not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't. I wasn't ready for the next part, the part where everything would require names, explanations, decisions. The part where real life returned. Eventually, I sat up and swung my legs over the edge of the bed. My feet touched the cold floor, and it grounded me, if only slightly. I glanced at the nightstand. Nothing there. No note. No message. Just the usual things, a glass of water, a book I hadn't finished in months, a lamp I rarely turned on. In the bathroom, I avoided the mirror. I didn't want to see my own face yet. I wasn't sure what it would show, guilt, confusion, clarity. I didn't feel any one thing clearly enough to recognize it. It was all just noise beneath the surface. Downstairs, the house was exactly as we had left it. A jacket draped over the armrest. The faint scent of him still hanging in the air. I opened a window slightly, not to get rid of it, but because I needed air. Real air. Fresh, unfiltered, indifferent air. I made coffee without thinking, measuring grounds with mechanical precision. The sound of the machine, the smell of the brew, they helped. They reminded me that the world was still turning, even if something inside me had shifted. I sat at the kitchen table, fingers wrapped around the warm mug, staring out the window. The garden looked the same. The trees swayed gently, the leaves already starting to curl with the change of season. Nothing had changed. And yet everything had. By the time the coffee was gone, I knew I had to get dressed. The day wouldn't pause just because I wanted it to. I showered quickly, letting the water rinse away whatever traces remained of the night before. I dressed simply, jeans, a sweater, flats. Something neutral. Something safe. There was a knock at the door around 10. I froze. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I thought it was him, maybe returning, maybe with something to say. My heart jumped, then steadied. I walked slowly to the door and opened it. It was my husband. He stood there with his suitcase in one hand and a bag of pastries in the other. His smile was tired but real. "Flight got cancelled," he said. "Thought I'd surprise you." I forced a smile, the kind that looks right but feels wrong. "You did." He stepped inside, kissed my cheek, set the bag on the counter. I followed him wordlessly, my eyes scanning the room like it belonged to someone else. He chatted while unpacking, something about the airline, the storm in another state, a colleague who'd missed the flight entirely. I nodded in the right places, laughed softly when expected, but my mind was elsewhere. My body was here, but the rest of me was still hovering in the space between what happened and what came next. Later, we sat in the living room with our coffee. He reached for my hand, and I let him. His fingers were warm, familiar. They used to bring me comfort. Today, they felt foreign, not in a bad way, just distant. Like they were part of a language I'd forgotten how to speak fluently. He leaned his head back against the cushion, eyes closed for a moment. "It's good to be home," he said. I wanted to believe that. I wanted it to feel good. But the truth was, I didn't feel at home in myself. Not now. Maybe not for a while. I got up, said I needed to check on the laundry, and escaped to the hallway. I stood there for a long time, hand resting on the dryer, waiting for my breath to even out. He hadn't noticed anything. Or if he had, he hadn't said. That was his way, to let things settle, to avoid unnecessary confrontation. I used to think it was kindness. Lately, it felt like distance disguised as peace. I went back to the kitchen, pulled the bag of pastries open, and busied myself arranging them on a plate. He walked in behind me, wrapped his arms around my waist, rested his chin on my shoulder. I didn't pull away. But I didn't lean in either. "We should go somewhere this weekend," he murmured. "Just us." I nodded, unsure if he could see the hesitation in my eyes. "Maybe the coast," he offered. "We haven't done that in a while." "It sounds nice," I said, though I wasn't sure it did. He kissed my cheek again and stepped away, reaching for his coffee. I watched him move through the kitchen like he always did, comfortable, unhurried. The man I had shared a life with for decades. The man I once couldn't imagine living without. And yet, now I wasn't sure I knew how to live with him either. The rest of the day passed in a blur of small tasks, errands, light cleaning, emails. We spoke, laughed even, but there was a hollowness to it. A performance of closeness, practiced over time. Easy to repeat, harder to feel. That night, in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling again. Just as I had the morning before. His breathing slowed, deepened. Sleep came easy to him. I envied that. I lay awake for hours, heart heavy with everything I couldn't say. Not because I didn't trust him. But because I no longer trusted myself. Time passed, but I couldn't say how much. Days bled together in quiet repetition, morning coffee, afternoon errands, dinner that tasted like routine. I kept moving, doing, cleaning, arranging. My hands stayed busy so my mind wouldn't wander. But it always did, slipping backward into moments I couldn't undo and forward into futures I couldn't picture. My husband settled back into his patterns with ease. He wasn't distant, but he wasn't present either. That was always the paradox of him. He could be right there in the room and yet 1,000 miles away, his thoughts wrapped around deadlines, construction schedules, business calls. He spoke more lately, made more of an effort, casual affection, small plans, gentle questions. I answered with smiles and nods. I didn't lie, but I didn't reveal much either. It was safer that way. The memory of that night hadn't faded. If anything, it grew sharper in contrast to the dullness of everything else. Not because of the act itself, but because of what it awakened. It was like a thread had been pulled in the center of my life, and now everything else was slightly unraveling. I couldn't pretend the same way I used to. I didn't see him again. Not since that morning. I hadn't called. Neither had he. Part of me wondered if we had an unspoken agreement, that the night had been a kind of closing chapter. Or maybe we were both afraid to test what would come next. I wasn't sure what I wanted anymore. That was the hardest part. It wasn't about choosing between two people. It was about figuring out where I'd gone in the midst of all the years, all the compromises, all the quiet letting go of things I hadn't even noticed were being let go. One afternoon, I sat in the living room folding laundry, something I'd done 1,000 times. A towel, a shirt, a pair of socks, each item methodically folded, stacked, moved. My hands worked while my mind circled a single question: how had I arrived here? Not in this house, not in this moment, but in this version of myself that felt both familiar and foreign. The front door opened behind me. My husband stepped in, carrying groceries. I turned and greeted him with a smile that wasn't forced but wasn't whole either. He kissed my cheek, set the bags down, and asked about my day. I told him the basics: the weather, an article I'd read, a neighbor I'd seen. The kind of small talk that fills the silence without revealing anything. After dinner, we took a walk. He suggested it. Said it had been a while. We walked around the neighborhood, past the same houses with the same trimmed lawns and wind chimes. I used to love this route. It had once felt like home. Now it felt like a map of everything I used to be. He talked about remodeling the kitchen. About taking a trip in the spring. About maybe getting a dog, something to bring more life into the house. I listened. I responded. But a part of me stood outside the conversation, watching myself nod and smile, wondering when I had become so good at playing the role I'd once written for myself. That night, he fell asleep quickly. I stayed awake, as I often did now. I stared at the ceiling, counted my breaths, traced invisible lines on the blanket with my fingers. Eventually, I got up and walked through the darkened house. The kitchen was quiet, moonlight spilling through the windows. I opened a cabinet, closed it again. Poured a glass of water I didn't drink. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching surfaces not to clean them, but to remind myself that I was still here. In the hallway, I paused outside the guest room. It hadn't been touched since he left. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of his cologne, barely there, but enough to pull something in me tight. His pillow still held the shape of his sleep. The blanket was folded at the foot of the bed, but unevenly, as if he'd left in a hurry. I sat on the edge of the mattress, hands resting in my lap. The silence was thicker here. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the sound of his voice, the exact weight of his hand on my shoulder, the way he looked at me when I wasn't looking away. I stayed there for a long time. Not crying. Not thinking. Just feeling the full weight of everything I hadn't said, everything I'd let happen, and everything I still didn't understand. Eventually, I stood up, closed the door gently behind me, and returned to the bedroom. The next morning, I woke early. My husband was already up, reading the news in the kitchen. He smiled when I entered, poured me a cup of coffee before I even asked. We sat across from each other, a quiet rhythm between us. Familiar. Safe. He asked if I had any plans for the day. I told him I wasn't sure yet. Maybe I'd go for a drive. Maybe I'd stop by the bookstore. Maybe I'd just sit in the garden and let the hours pass without needing to fill them. He nodded, and we moved on. Later that day, I found myself in the same park where I had gone weeks before, the lake, the bench, the quiet path that curved through the trees. I sat there for over an hour, watching the wind ripple the water, watching strangers pass with dogs, strollers, coffee cups. I didn't think about him. I didn't think about my husband. I thought about myself. Not in the selfish way I used to fear, but in the kind of way that asks gently, persistently, what now? Because the truth was, something had changed. And I didn't know yet where it would lead. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to find out.